dying at peace. I'm not saying that we can live as long as we want, but we don't have to die until we are ready. The most obvious proof of this is the time people die in the hospital. The vast majority die in the early hours of the morning when the lifesavers are resting and the family has left or fallen asleep. Then there is no interference with or guilt over leaving. All of us, especially those who are living with serious illness or trauma, are constantly balancing the rewards of life versus the cost of living. One patient told me that as long as she had 5 good minutes a day, she would keep on living. The pain and fear of dying come primarily from conflict, unfinished business, and hanging on so as not to fail one's family. We can learn to live each day as a unit, doing what needs to be done, giving and receiving love, and thus always being prepared to die. As one patient told me, death is not the worst thing. Life without love is far worse. Having mastered the art of living day by day, we can always manage 24 hours if we have an important goal to reach. This postponement can last a long time. I was giving a pep talk on the subject to Melanie, a nurse with breast cancer. She said, "You don't have to tell me that. My mother came home one day when I was 16 and said, 'Girls, I've been told I have leukemia and that I'm going to die within a year. But I am not going to die until you're all married and out of the house.' 8 years later, she attended her youngest daughter's wedding. Many times I have witnessed the death of people who have learned to love fully. It's a peaceful, pain-free letting go in which no time is spent dying. However, 2 conditions have to be met before this can happen. The doctor as lifesaver must be told when to stop, and loved ones must give the patient permission to go. They must share their love and grief, but let the dying person know that they will be able to survive. In other words, the dying person must not receive a don't die message from the family. He or she must receive their love and support, and the knowledge that the loved ones will survive because they have been loved. The example the dying person has been reveals how precious life is, even as it is being given up. My own father told me about his grandfather who at the age of 91 said, "Get my friends together and get me a bottle of schnapps, I'm going to die tonight." To humor him, the family complied. That night, after the party, he went upstairs, laid down, and died. Each of us has that option. I might choose to live when someone else might choose to die, but that depends on what we need to accomplish and how much loving remains to be done. Label someone terminal and he is treated as dead. This is wrong. If you are alive, you can still participate by loving, laughing, and living. Before I would accept a quadriplegic's decision to die, I would have him take 1 month of art lessons from another quadriplegic who does incredibly beautiful paintings holding the brush in his mouth. An elderly gentleman had fallen down the stairs and was admitted to the hospital in coma. He and his wife had been married over 60 years. The next day, she had a heart attack and was admitted to the medical service. He was in coma, she was on a respirator, and they were on 2 different floors. I suggested to the intern that he should let each of them know about the other's condition, since there obviously could be no direct communication. I said, if one dies, the other ought to know what has happened. The interns all thought it was spooky, so I whispered in the ear of each what had happened to the other. The next day I came to the hospital, and the intern said, "Do you know what happened?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "Mr. Smith died," and I had picked up the phone to call the intern on the medical floor to get the number of the niece who was the next of kin. The intern there said, "That's funny, I'm looking for it. What do you need it for?" Mr. Smith had just died, and the other intern said his wife had just died. The wife followed him by 5 minutes. What a gentleman. He went and picked up his wife, and they left together. A drawn-out living death happens when feelings are unspoken, conflicts remain unresolved, and life goes on only for the sake of others. It occurs when the dying one receives don't die messages which define death as a failure, something that must be done in secret when doctors and loved ones are absent. When people achieve peace with themselves and others, it becomes all right to die, to relax and enjoy it, as one of my patients put it. But paradoxically, this very acceptance may produce healing. I felt Valerie was only about 48 hours from death, and because of her husband's reluctance to accept the situation, I decided to help get the family together. On Tuesday night, I explained the situation to her husband and suggested that he call their girls to come home from college. He said he would. On Wednesday night, Valerie talked to me about her husband. "Do you know what he says when you leave? He says, "Don't die, don't die." I asked her, "Have you ever done anything for yourself in your life?" "No." "Then it's perfectly all right to die," I said. "But before you die, I'd like you to straighten out your relationship with your husband." I came back later that night. Valerie was out of bed, pointing toward her husband, who was standing by the window. She said, "I just told him a few things, some of which he didn't want to hear." And Thursday morning she was looking wonderful, and she said, "I have 2 questions. Where did all this energy come from, and why are the nurses in my room all the time now?" I told her, "The nurses are in your room because you're not dying anymore, and the energy comes from resolving your conflict with your husband. I don't know if a miracle will happen, but I think you should get up and go home." "That is a little scary," she said. "I thought I was supposed to die today." Valerie's remission lasted for 2 or 3 months, a little miracle, during which she lived at home, accomplishing beautiful things with her family. She then died peacefully at home, surrounded by love. This example did more for the nursing staff than any number of lectures. They all saw what happens when someone resolves conflicts and finds new energy to heal. If we could do this with all our patients at an earlier stage, not only would they live longer and better, but we would probably increase the number of self-induced cures dramatically. It's amazing how seldom members of the hospital staff visit patients who are close to death. If you shut the door, no one comes in. I was once even questioned about killing someone because of this fear of seeing death. I was in a meeting when I received a call from Muriel, a young woman almost unable to breathe and near death from extensive cancer. She told me, "You say dying's easy." I looked up at the sky and said, "I'm ready," and nothing happened. So I explained, "It's because you're too agitated. I can't get there till 5 o'clock, but then I'll come and help you. If patients want to wait, they will." When I came in, she was filled with fear and anger and had been given no sedation. I tried to tell her that it is hard to die angry and fearful. It keeps you oriented to your body. You have to relax and let go. Then I asked for some morphine, enough to calm her and ease her pain. Because of Muriel's youth, this was a frightening scene for the nurses. They had to be thinking, this could be one of us in that bed. Only a brave medical student was there besides me and the patient's family. After the morphine took effect, her breathing became easier, and we had a wonderful couple of hours filled with love and laughter. She literally came alive again, and at one point said she'd be coming back as the first woman president. By 7 o'clock, Muriel looked so much better that I thought maybe she was changing her mind, and I asked her, "Do you mind if I go get dinner?" She said no. I came back in half an hour, and she had died. I know that was her way of making it easier for me. The nurses had announced she had died, but when I walked into the room, the intravenous pump was still running, and everything else was connected as though she was still alive. The nurses had difficulty dealing with her death. Later that night, I heard that one of the nurses had called an administrator and said I might have killed the patient with morphine. The administrator wouldn't call me because he wasn't an MD, so it worked its way up to the medical chief of staff, who was at a party. The next day, the chief of staff, who knows me well, called me and I explained what had happened. But the part that pained me was the nurse's inability to come into that room. She would have seen how beautiful Muriel's last hours were. These hours are gifts of love that help all the survivors go on. A patient of mine who died recently left me a note saying, "Thank you for the love. I can take it with me. She healed me and her family and all who touched her." New meaning in life and death. There's a story about 2 businessmen who were driving to an important meeting. Each was to receive $50,000 tax-free, but they had to get there in 1 hour. On the way, each had a flat tire. The first businessman got out, looked in the trunk, and found he had no jack. He looked at his watch, saw that he had to reach his appointment within 10 minutes, and had a heart attack on the spot. The other businessman looked in the trunk and also saw he had no jack. He stood by the car. A passerby stopped, changed his tire for him, and he made his appointment in time. I subscribe to the Jungian idea of synchronicity or meaningful coincidence. I believe that there are very few accidents. After one of my talks, a man handed me a card on which was written, "Coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous." In a life out of harmony with itself, events seem to conspire to go wrong. But by the same token, they mesh wondrously when you start to live your bliss. Perhaps this is another way of saying you create your own opportunities out of the same raw materials from which other people create their defeats. I call these apparent setbacks spiritual flat tires. unexpected events that can have positive or negative outcomes depending on how we respond to them. One morning, Rose, a student who worked with me, got into her car to come help me in the operating room. Her car broke down, so she got on her bike and it broke. At that point, she said to herself, well, according to Bernie, I belong back in my apartment. She went back, and as she entered her apartment, the phone rang. It was her brother, a former drug addict, calling from Maine. He said, "Thank God you're there. I was just about to head for New York and go back on drugs." They talked for about an hour. She calmed him, and he promised to stay until another family member could go and be with him. She then went out to her car and lifted the hood, saying to herself, "I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know anything about engines." At that moment, her other brother drove up and said, "I was driving down the parkway, and a voice said to me, 'Go buy your sister's house.'" He fixed her car, and she came to the hospital with her eyes wide open. She will never need another sermon again. To become an authentic spiritual person means to open to our intuition, the part of us that knows. As Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has said, decisions based on cold reason alone are usually made to satisfy others. Intuitive decisions make us feel good, even if others think we're crazy. But as we become authentic, we no longer worry about what others think. As a healer, I'm trying to get people to have faith in their own lives and in the whole process of life. You can act from that faith and make the rest of your life simple, or you can keep testing and make the rest of your life difficult. No matter what good things happen, you'll always be able to say, "It could be a coincidence," and never enjoy the grace. Instead, I counsel you to choose your direction, make the leap of faith, and fly. How do you know if you have faith? The only way I can explain it is to tell you about the man who fell over the side of a cliff, grabbed hold of a very small bush, and was hanging there watching its roots gradually pull loose. At that moment, he looked up toward heaven and said, "God, you have to save me." And a beautiful melodious voice said, "Don't worry, my son, I'll save you. Let go." The man looked back up and said, "Is anybody else up there?" If you don't have to ask that second question, you have faith. There are hidden channels of communication from the unconscious to our conscious minds. Since I've made patients understand that it's safe to tell me any experience they've had, I've encountered cases of precognition many times. One Monday, I operated on a man named Mike, who had a massive hemorrhage from an aneurysm that had ruptured into his esophagus. It was impossible to stop the bleeding, and he died. When I talked to his wife, she said, Sunday we spent the whole day discussing his funeral and will. And I said, why do we have to talk about all this morbid business? And now I know. Several times I found that close relatives knew of a person's death before they had received news of it. My own father, who is now almost 80, told me that his mother visited him spiritually one day at work when he was a young man. She said goodbye. He knew she had died, and he grew terribly sad. His co-workers noticed, but he couldn't tell them what had happened because it sounded crazy. As soon as he got home, the phone rang, and his sister told him their mother had died. Sandy told me her experience of the same intuitive knowledge. Her husband, Harry, always drove the kids to school. But one day, all three of them were late getting dressed. He got angry and left without them, and a few minutes later was killed in an accident. It seems obvious to me that there was an unconscious awareness in each of those children that this was not the day to get dressed and go with Dad. When Sandy called Harry's mother in Maine and started to talk, his mother said, "Yes, I know. Harry's dead." When asked how she knew, she replied, his father, who'd been dead a year, came to me last night and said, "I have to take our son tomorrow." These are the kinds of things that patients share with me, the privileged listener. One night, when I was giving a lecture, I had all my notes in front of me. And yet, as I was giving the talk, I realized that in a sense, two talks were being given. In one, I was struggling to follow the outline, but something else was coming out of my mouth. I realized the other talk was much better, so I finally just gave in and let it happen. When I came off the stage, I told Bobby, "I don't know who gave the talk. I didn't." The next woman who came up to me said, "I've heard you before, but that was more moving than usual." The third person who came up to me said, "I'm a medium, and while you were reading a letter superimposed over you, staring at the audience, was this figure. I drew him for you." And she showed me a picture of my guide, George. This experience taught me that the unconscious can take care of everything, and I don't have to prepare for my lectures anymore. Whether George exists as a spiritual guide or simply exists inside of me as part of my collective unconscious or intuition, the power is there for all of us. If we will let it come through. As Socrates replied when asked if he had prepared his defense, what needs to be said will be said. Death is no barrier to this intuitive spiritual consciousness. It continues after death, and it communicates between the dead and the living. Iris, a blind diabetic who developed cancer, underwent a similar experience. One day she called her 2 daughters into her hospital room and told them, "Girls, I can see again." My mother and father came for me and held out an apple. They said when I bite into it, I will join them. I told them my grandson's birthday was on Tuesday, and I would join them then. She died after the party on Tuesday. Before she passed away, one of her daughters said, "Mom, if you die, I want to die too. I can't go on without you." 2 weeks later, Iris appeared to her daughter and said, "Look, I have 10 minutes. This is against the rules. I am in a beautiful place and I am loved. I can't be worrying about you doing something silly." As I have opened myself to my patients' beliefs, I have received many messages from those who have died. Josie was a wonderful woman who had given everyone who knew her the gift of love and humor. While at the hospice, for example, she thought she heard a noise and asked if someone was at the door. The nurse said, "Oh, I just kicked your bucket." And Josie replied, "I'm here trying to kick the bucket, and for you it's easy." She was one of those exceptional people who lived until the moment of death. Josie had asked me to deliver the eulogy at her funeral. I said I would be honored, but told her I couldn't be sure my schedule would permit it, especially since the funeral would be held in New York. Months before, I had arranged to be in New York on a certain Friday for a conference, the only day in the entire year I was scheduled to be in New York. Then a radio talk show host asked me to speak for an hour at noon on that day. Since I would already be in the city, I agreed, but on the Monday before the show, someone from the station called and said the program had been preempted. I told my wife that Josie's funeral would be at that time, although she hadn't died yet. On Tuesday evening, Josie's husband asked me how to help ease her passage. She found it hard to leave amid the constant visiting and expressions of love. I suggested he tell her he loved her, that he and the boys would be okay, and she could go if she was ready. He shared that with her the next morning, and then turned to get her breakfast tray. When he turned back, she had died. Josie's son called me to tell me she had died, and there had been a debate about whether to have the funeral Friday or Sunday. I said, "Your mother wants it at noon on Friday." He said, "I don't know how you know, but that's what we decided." After I'd learned of Josie's death, I went to meditate in the hospital chapel, a small closet-like room with no windows. A plaque on the wall suddenly began to shake for no discernible reason. I looked at it and read the message. "In the midst of life, I am with you." I knew it was a message from Josie. On Friday, as I was nearing the end of my eulogy, the loudspeaker in the funeral home suddenly went off. I felt that was another message from Josie saying, "Enough already."